desafio para perguntas e eu convido a Ana Lúcia Vilela para ser a mediadora.
What is the role of nature? Or what should be the role of nature inside schools? What could we do to change this around? Like you said, it's impossible to paint the picture of the future if kids don't have nature, to live with. Here in Brazil, like United States, we have also a problem, a recess problem. They are shorter and shorter, no creative play allowed, not a lot of nature, sometimes any, depending on the case of the school. So I would like you to talk a little bit more about that.
First, I should say that 10 years ago, when I first started giving my sermonettes, and by the way, my speeches get harder and harder for me. I think it's because I've learned too much, and I try to pack it all into the same speech. Over those 10 years, it's gotten actually harder. But 10 years ago, teachers were the worst audience. Partly it's because they would talk among themselves and pass notes, which I understand teachers tend to do in groups. But also I would see this kind of flat expression on their face. In the United States, and perhaps that's true here, they're so overwhelmed, asked to do so many things that society isn't doing itself. And increasingly they were moving into this testing period in which everything was testing, and the creativity of teachers was being forcefully diminished by education policies. So here comes this guy, he's asking us to get kids outdoors, great, one more thing to do. I understand that. I also thought at the time, well, this is the first denatured generation of teachers, young people who didn't have much experience in nature when they were growing up. I think I was wrong. Today, teachers are among the best audiences. They get it. They're fed up with the testing trend. They're fed up with recess being canceled. They're fed up with the limitations on their creativity. Now, their administration may not be fed up. Education reform leaders may not be fed up, but the teachers are ready. There's a study that was done in Canada, at least one study, that showed that teachers who get their kids outdoors don't burn out as soon. So there's a lot in this for teachers. They're trapped in the same classrooms. I visited a school a few months ago. CBS News asked me to go to a school outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And they did a segment for CBS early morning. And this was a school that, to my surprise and great pleasure, turned out to have been inspired in part by Last Child in the Woods, and that's why they asked me to go there. This was an amazing school. It was, all the classrooms were individual buildings, and they were all glass in the front. And you could open up the whole fronts of these classrooms to the outdoors. And there were gardens everywhere, there were fields. The school was surrounded by woods and hiking trails. The students were mainly low-income African-American students. Some of them were busked in from Atlanta. And they were on fire. They were so excited to be there. One little boy, 6-year-old, raced into the classroom and said, Miss Miller, there's so much nature out here, and I've only got 2 eyes, and I've only got 1 brain, and I think I'm gonna explode. Don't you just want that kind of energy in a classroom? And the kids were like that. They were amazing. They could explain far better than even the principal or the teachers why learning outside worked, whether it's math or science or poetry under the trees or art. Whatever the topic is, it seems to work better when you're outside for most kids. Not all, but for most. That school is doing better, as it turns out, in academic improvement than any other school in that county, which includes Atlanta. It's doing better in academic improvement. It's also doing better in terms of physical health. These kids turn out, there's low-income kids. These kids in this school turn out on average, to be healthier than the kids in most of the other schools, including the affluent schools for the wealthy people in the north part of the county. Now, the folks in Scandinavia, educators who have what are called all-weather schools, where the kids are required to go outside at least part of the day, no matter what the weather, they already know that kids in those schools get fewer colds and less flu. They're healthier. So there are so many advantages to having nature be part of schools, and finally we're starting to get the evidence that it actually raises standardized test scores, which for some reason those standardized test scores are the only thing that education administrations care about these days.
Richard, I'd like to know if the relationship between the kids and nature requires a mediator, and if yes, what type of mediator? Mediator?
Mediator?
Yeah. And what are the qualities that this person needs to have?
Well, Rachel Carson's wrote that to connect a child to nature, you need two things. You need a special place and a special adult in that child's life. So we need both. We do need mediators. But when we're talking about this, what we don't need is adults hovering over kids in the woods with nature flashcards. You know, we need to learn to step back and let the kid dig a hole. You know, let the kid discover an anthill on his own or her own. In the newest book, which is called Vitamin N, which has 500 things that people can do. There's a woman who told me that she doesn't, do you have the phrase helicopter parent here? You know what that is? That's the parent that just hovers right over the kid all the time.
Yesterday we were talking about a little bit at the restaurant about self-esteem of the people who work directly with nature, the lack of self-esteem they have. They feel that it's more important to be working in some company in a high building in the city area than being a fisherman and so on. And also the role of the indigenous people, and you know, they are guardians of nature somehow, and we don't really respect that. So how can we bring these people who work with nature, who know and understand about nature, who are there every day, to our world, to have a good example?
I think what you're talking about is a major politician in Brazil, in a major speech, told the story of a fisherman who, and it was good news to this politician that this fisherman was no longer a fisherman, but was now working on drilling for oil. I think that diminishment of people who work in nature and work with their hands is unfortunate. We can't have a future that is just people drilling for oil and working on computers. We need people who have direct experience in nature. In terms of indigenous people, whether it's in the United States or here, I know in the United States, the True Nature Network, we have not done a good job of engaging indigenous people. First Nations, American Indians, we've not done a good job. Most of that is our fault. Part of it is because the indigenous people in the United States have nature deficit disorder in some ways even more than Caucasian people in suburban wealthy neighborhoods. I'd love that to be a custom in the United States, and I've written that. I have a feeling it would be great in Brazil too. That's one way to include people as this movement begins to grow.
Richard, what's the importance of risk associated with an unstructured play? And what type of risk do you think kids should take?
Risk is it's not only fear of strangers in the United States that keeps parents from letting their kids go outdoors. It's two things. Yes, it's risk of strangers, but it's also risk of strange lawyers. Because it's a very, very litigious society in the United States. I don't know how litigious you are, but schools, in California, for instance, there is something called the fall zone rule for preschools. You can't have two raised places, like two logs next to each other. You have to assure that those are just far enough apart so that two children standing one on that log and one on that if they fall, their heads won't hit each other. That's actually a regulation for preschools. I don't know if it's that bad here. Yeah. So this relationship between physical risk and getting sued is felt very keenly in the United States. I spoke earlier about comparative risk. There's no, in the U.S. courts, in the jury system, there's no such thing as a good risk. There's no such thing as an appropriate risk, something that actually prevents greater risks later. In order to be challenged later by something that is truly life-threatening as a teenager, you have to have taken a few risks to know what to do when you're little. It turns out a natural habitat is a pretty good place to have manageable risk, to learn that. I learned recently from a psychologist, a child psychologist named Joe Frost, a wonderful guy. He said that the number one reason that kids get hurt or break bones when they climb trees is because their upper body strength isn't good enough to hold on to the limb, which makes kind of common sense. And what he said, and I paraphrased him in the title of a chapter in the new book, and the title of that chapter is "Don't Cut Down the Tree, Build Up the Kid." It's a metaphor. It's a different way to look at risk for kids.
There is a question from Isabella Reis. She works in a national park, but it's very close to here, Serra dos Órgãos. And she would like to know if you know any example of, or like a school inside the national park, and that really, that it's a good strategy of connecting kids to nature instead of only like educative visits in the national park.
That's a great question, and I should know the answer, and I don't. It may exist in the United States, and I'm going to find out about that. There is a school on the park. But what I can tell you is one of the things that has happened in this Children in Nature movement happened about 6 months ago, and it was great news. I was invited to go to Chicago, where President Obama was going to make a big announcement. He announced new national monuments, new parks, but he began by announcing a White House initiative called Every Kid in the Park. And what that means is, as of last September, every fourth grader in the United States and that fourth grader's whole family, if the family goes with the child, gets a free pass for a whole year to any national park or any other federal lands or waters. They're working, the national park system actually is working with schools now. They're working with corporations to raise money for buses so they can take kids from these schools to some of the national parks. They're going to focus primarily, or at least in the beginning, on inner city schools, kids that would never have any chance to see a national park. That's, I think, a great step forward, not only because it will connect, the head of the National Park Service in the United States, I consider a friend, and he was so excited that day. And his vision was, unless Donald Trump gets elected, that for the next dozen years, every class of fourth graders for the next dozen years will get a chance to experience some kind of wilderness. And at the end of that 12 years, a whole generation would have been touched by nature. That's his dream. So I'm very excited about that.
Thinking about that idea, could you give us other examples or thoughts on how kids from poor neighborhoods, from slums, that they don't have access to nature, people who don't have access to nature, what can we do to provide nature for them somehow, to, ideas? to guarantee this right?
One thing is to be careful how we define nature. Nature is not just Yosemite National Park or your national parks. One of the things that the Sierra Club began doing several years ago is they have volunteers and they go into inner city neighborhoods and they put backpacks on kids and they go for a 5-mile hike in their own neighborhood and they look for nature. These are inner city neighborhoods and they find nature. It doesn't look like Yosemite National Park. It can be the grass and the ants that live between the cracks in the sidewalk. It can be an alleyway that, plants are growing in. It can be the trees in an urban park. And they find nature. And they see it on a smaller scale, but they do find it. So that's a first step, is be careful how we define nature and to recognize the nature that is around us. I love your film, by the way, because it showed kids experiencing that small nature, one tree, one little patch of grass. Now, you can't just do that, obviously. One of the precepts of the second book of the Nature Principle is that conservation is no longer enough. Now we need to create nature. As strange as that sounds, we won't have the biodiversity that the Earth needs because of the biodiversity collapse. We won't have that even if we protected every square inch of wildness that we've still got, and I believe we should. But even if we did that, it won't be sufficient for the needed biodiversity. Therefore, we have to change where we live. As of 2008, more people in the world live in cities than in the countryside. First time in human history. Huge moment in human history. Largely goes unremarked. That means one of two things. That either means that the human species will continue to lose whatever contact or connection that we have, even spiritually, to the rest of the natural world. Or it means the beginning of a new kind of city. Now, Rio is a great city. You've got lots of nature here that somehow has been preserved. But in city after city, Sao Paulo, certainly that's true. In my city, even in San Diego, where we have the highest biodiversity of any county in the United States, in San Diego. But we need to create nature too. And what that means is making sure that we replace a lot of our yards with native species. It means creating through design new kinds of buildings that have green roofs, that have vertical farms. Skyscrapers can be created as vertical farms in dense urban areas, that we can begin to bring back butterfly migration routes, as I mentioned. There's a lot of exciting things going on around the world along that line, here, there, but nobody's really put that together in an image of what really could happen in cities. So I think creating nature is something that we could engage kids in also. Think of the power that kids would feel if they were part of creating a homegrown, worldwide homegrown park, starting in their own backyard by planting native species with the help of their school, the help of the Natural History Museum, and so forth. That can be a part of the Children of Nature movement too.
I'm going to change a little bit now for pediatricians. We were talking about education and families a little bit now. Yesterday we heard Danielle Becker talking in São Paulo. In Rio, they're trying to do a process promoting sensibility for the issue of children and nature. Among them, they are creating, perhaps, they're trying to create a committee for children and environment, showing the importance of nature and free play. And the question is, do you have any suggestion that might help convincing all pediatricians in our country, to embrace this movement?
I think there's a pediatrician here from Germany that I met.
No, there's Danielle Becker, and also Ricardo Delmo. He's going to give a speech today.
I gave the keynote address, was asked to give the keynote to the 2010 National Conference of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And it was several thousand pediatricians and pediatric nurse practitioners in the audience in San Francisco. I was really nervous about giving this speech. Because if there's anybody that parents trust in terms of advice, it's pediatricians. Hugely important people in a movement like this. Fortunately, my wife is a nurse practitioner. And so before I flew up to San Francisco to give this speech, being nervous, she took my face in her hands and she said, "Rich, listen to me. Pediatricians are different from other doctors. They're really, really nice people." Now, that's not entirely true, but I led with that at my speech to the pediatricians, and they liked that, of course. And so we got off to a good start. But here's what I said to them. I said, "Look, pediatricians, I'm not going to ask you to have an official American Academy of Pediatrics policy on nature deficit disorder. I'm not going to ask that, because I know the first thing you're going to ask me for is the 30-year longitudinal studies. To which I would say to you, pediatricians, where the hell were you 30 years ago when you should have started those studies? Nobody thought to ask the question 30 years ago." And the pediatricians understood, and they liked that. They got it. And it turns out, and a pediatric occupational therapist who's very active in the movement taught me this. She said pediatricians every day prescribe pharmaceuticals, drugs, to kids that have never been tested on kids. It's because of the logical rules to prevent children as test subjects. So they already know that a lot of what they do is art, and they are a little bit more flexible on the evidence because they know that there are things, that prescriptions they're writing already, they're not absolutely sure because they've not been tested on children. Pediatricians are also ready because they see kids coming into their office now with morbidities that they did not see 15 years ago. Depression among small children, child obesity, all of these issues, carpal tunnel syndrome, all of these issues that they weren't seeing years ago. And now they are, and they don't know what to do, because whatever we're doing on some of those problems, it's not working. And so they're actually quite open to this idea. I like to say, I had a junior high principal who used to like to say, "Be careful what you say, someone may be listening." After that conference, several physicians went back and changed their practices. And one of them is a guy named Dr. Robert Zarr, and if you go on ZARR, if you Google him, you'll find his story. He went back to Washington, D.C., organized the pediatricians of Washington, D.C. to literally start writing prescriptions to nature, which is the second thing I asked those. I said, here's what I'm not going to ask you to do, have an official policy. What I am going to ask you to do, pediatricians, is to use your wisdom and your experience to take care of your patients the way you think works best. And if that includes writing a prescription for nature, please do it. So in the US, you have Robert Zarr. He actually went even beyond just organizing pediatricians. They created a database of all the parks in Washington, D.C., so the pediatrician can look at the computer, turn to the family and say, here's the prescription for nature, and there's a park 2 blocks from your house. There are what are called parks prescriptions happening now in the United States. Many of the state and federal parks are beginning to adopt these campaigns. So I think pediatricians are a powerful, powerful ally, and they're more ready than one might assume to join you in this movement.
This is going to be our last question. If a family wants to get more connected to nature, if there are groups that already exchange experience, even if it's online, so if you know any groups that could do and could help that.
Well, you're going to be creating a lot of things online. It'll be very useful. The reason the Children in Nature Network was created, and I We don't have things translated into Portuguese. We've got some things translated into Spanish and Chinese, but we don't have Portuguese yet. And maybe we can work together on that. But you can go to the website and you can learn what's happening all around the world. There's an aggregation of news there. But one of the reasons we did that is because someplace had to bring together on an ongoing way the available research. Nobody was doing that, which I think is kind of an academic scandal. Why isn't Harvard or Yale making this kind of information available to everybody in the world? A lot of it is behind academic firewalls. You have to you have to subscribe to a very expensive journal or pay to read it. So we've done an end run around that to make that available to everybody. But one of the things that we promote, that I hope that you do too, is the idea of family nature clubs. Family nature clubs are multiple families that join together to go outside. It's that simple. The Family Nature Club in my city of San Diego, that was formed about 3 years ago, now has 1,500 families, not individuals, families in it. And what they do, they don't all show up at the park together, all 1,500 at the same time. That would be a problem. But this is a pool of families that you as a parent can dip into and announce, I want to take my family on a hike next Saturday at such and such place. Any families like to join us? And so what you'll see is 4, 5, even 10 families going together on a nature adventure, gardening or hiking, something like that, going to the park, an urban park or outside town. They go together. There's some advantages of that. It deals to a degree with the fear issue. There's perceived safety in numbers. You don't have to wait for a foundation to fund you. You don't have to wait for government. You can download a free toolkit, and maybe we can work together to get it into Portuguese. You can, it's already?
We already have one.
Oh,
it's on our website.
Great. And where's that? Where do you get that?
On our website.
What is the website at?
Yeah, criançanatureza.org.br. Chama Clubes Natureza em Família.
I should have known that. This works also for any kind of economic group, whether they're inner city or outside of a city. Anybody can start one of these. There are now hundreds of these family nature clubs. Many of them have hundreds of families in them. One of the important things about that also is that single parent families are particularly helped by this, because when you think of the logistics they face, how in the world do you organize that? Well, other families can help you. It's also important because you've got a young generation of parents now, many of whom have had very little experience in nature. So even when they know about the research and want to get that for their kids, they don't have a clue as to where to start. But some other family does. And so if you join with other families, it'll make it a lot easier. Finally, one of the advantages of that is, in order for this movement to really grow, to begin to change education, to change the face of cities, to change the future, you have to build a bigger boat. You have to have all kinds of people on board that maybe wouldn't be otherwise. You have to build a political and cultural constituency for this change. Family nature clubs happen to be one way to do that. In San Diego, 1,500 families who have a similar vision of the future can be a powerful force. That can happen here too.
Thank you very much, Richard. Please, can you please come?